Hello, everyone, and welcome to yet another episode of the War Report. It's been about 9 days by the time you guys will watch this since we've last spoken to you, and quite a bit has happened in that. Now, of course, there is the current news between Russia and Ukraine and in Eastern Europe, but there's also the major economic implications of that. Biden's statements, actually, just as of a few hours ago as we're recording this, and some slight news out of the Middle East, which somewhat connects back into this, especially when it comes to the oil market. But without further ado, I can tell you're chomping at the bit, so I will let you cover the fall of Mariupol and just give a general on the ground overview for our viewers on what's happening in Ukraine.
Well, to begin with Mariupol, this has been a long, drawn out siege. The majority of the Azov battalion and including some volunteers from abroad have been there for a very long time. Mariupol was one of those cities that stood up against the Kiev regime early on, and they occupied one of the governmental buildings there. I don't know if that's where the mayor's office was, but they were driven back. There's conflicting stories about, who told them to draw back. Some say it was the Russian government told them that they were not going to be able to withhold what they had taken. So they drew back. This was an area that in the 2010 election, 90% voted for Yanukovych. And that lets you know who was, considered the pro-Russian speaking representative of Ukraine before he was ousted from his presidency during the coup in 2013 and 14. Russia's policy has been more or less the same. That is, the least amount of strikes against civilian buildings as possible. That does not mean that's not ever going to happen, of course. Tactically, what the Russians have done is they've encircled or semi-encircled so many cities at the moment, including Kiev, Nikolaev, there's many others, Kharkov, that it's difficult for the Ukrainians to send forces because there's always, for them, the possibility that the Russians might inch closer. So that keeps everything tied up. But Mariupol has been a particularly important settlement for the Azov battalion. And they play a very pivotal role. Back in 2019, Zelensky went and visited them in the trenches, or it might have been the APU, but he basically he was talked back to, and Zelensky had to tell him, like, you know who I am? I'm the president of this country. Because remember, Zelensky ran on a platform that he would have referendums, that decisions about autonomy would be respected, and that there would be a stricter following, or at least an attempt at following the Minsk Accord. And this is the Minsk Accord 2, the Minsk Agreement. That was really done because the Ukrainian army suffered so many massive losses in Debaltsevo in January and February of 2014 that it was essentially like suing for peace. But as we know, through January and February of this year, Ukraine has never had any intentions. And you can see the effect of various nationalist groups within the army of Ukraine, in their National Guard, have on policy. So they are incredibly persuasive. They don't need political representation because their power is far more far-reaching than that. So it was estimated about 14,000 soldiers were hunkered down, both regular APU and Azov battalion, as well as foreign mercenaries, foreign volunteers. And it was a very slow going. This was a city that, for those who wanted to flee eastward, they were shot. Even westward was difficult because they were looked at as traitors. Azov always knew that this was an important city for the breakaway republics. It does belong in the Donetsk Republic, of which Donetsk city is like the capital. Mariupol is south of that. And so
Yes, and you'll
anyone who
recall
wanted to
it
flee,
during 2014, 2015, during the initial push, the initial break out of the war. Mariupol was one of the bloodiest battlegrounds. I remember the big celebration by the media when pro-government forces finally took it back from the separatists, and I thought that was going to be the
yeah,
end of the Donbass crisis. And then here we are. What at
yeah,
this point, 8 years later?
right. And there was one last push to retake it. The Donbass republics got as close to the suburbs, and then they pulled back. So you can see how well entrenched it was. And overall, for this war, usually casualties between military personnel and civilians is about 1 to 1. In this war, it's about 10 to 1. So this is a war with one of the lowest amounts of civilian casualties. Be that as it may, this week and the tail end of last week, um, there's been a very steady encroachment into Mariupol, and now we're looking about a 10% holdout in one of the factories. This factory's already been hit. Um, there are one or two civilian areas where they're holding out, but generally speaking, it's a foregone conclusion. In the meantime, the area in the western part of Donetsk Republic that the people of Donetsk Republic have never been able to hold on to, that part is slowly withering away. In the last 7 days, about 100 some odd settlements, these are small villages, have been taken. However, the majority of the Ukrainian forces are there. These guys are very battle hardened. They're well entrenched. There have been attempts to move back to some degree, but they are still able to fire Tochka rockets. Donetsk was hit last week with one again. There was another one that was hit that was launched against Lugansk. Some of these were intercepted, but these are kind of futile attempts. These are kind of um, acts of resentment. They want to inflict the most amount of pain as possible as they withdraw. There was another incident where it looked like either a rocket or a mortar fire directly hit an area in Kharkov that the Russians have been distributing aid and food, and it killed 6 people. So the Kiev regime has always known that these cities were only able to comply basically because of reprisals and a very heavy-handed rule. They would go along. That, of course, we know does not explain all of Ukraine. There's certain areas that are not like that at all, which is obvious. But in the east and in the southeast, that is the case. And so massive losses. They're estimating half the forces in Mariupol of the Ukrainian army and Azov battalion have been eliminated. I've seen the capture videos. I've seen some of them trying to flee in minivans, get shot up. Some of them even resorted to dressing as women to get out. Not really uncommon. I'm not saying neither here neither this or that by mentioning it. So now we're at a point where the Donetsk People's Republics and regular Russian forces can focus on cutting off the forces that are now in the Donbass, essentially. There's about 60,000, so far higher than the 14,000 that were holed up in Mariupol. And this week has been a week, including this morning, where the Russians have been bit by bit destroying fuel depots of the military. This morning they hit one in Lvov, but they've hit them all over the map.
Yes, and
So,
it's
and
it's
and then there was
wild
the
to see.
tank
I'll just say that
factory, the
much.
tank repair shop. What's that?
it's wild to see just that much, even in the context of the conflict.
Right. What they want to do now is basically make it impossible for that large contingent of fighters in the Donbass belonging to the Ukrainian forces to get out. That's essentially the point. And they will run out of fuel. They probably have a lot of munitions, but getting them into that area now will be very difficult. Prior to the near sacking of Mariupol, there were a lot of desperate calls from Azov Battalion leaders for relief, but no relief came. No relief could come. There was even one humanitarian corridor that came from the west along the shore of the Azov, and that was stopped, and they found armaments inside. So on a bigger scale, that is what Russia now wants to do with those forces that are holed up in eastern Ukraine. They have asked to be relieved by Zelensky. Zelensky has said, you're not giving up, you're not leaving. There are officers in the small towns in and around this area that are talking about that have given up. In fact, by some Russian reports, take that however you want. They're saying that officers are quitting in larger numbers. Now, about 2 weeks ago, Pravi sector showed up in an area just outside of Kharkov, if I'm not mistaken. 4 officers wanted to retreat to Kiev, and they were shot. So, zero retreat. I think in some ways that action itself basically betrays what the Russian policy is. I think deep down inside, when you get past the Western media, they know that the Russians are not going to storm Kiev. Uh, as I said in previous episodes, that would, on a metaphysical level, that would destroy the very reason for this invasion, right? Russia cannot succeed. As I've always maintained, Russia has a difficult task in rebuilding this area. But it will have an even more difficult task if, on top of that, if Ukraine is greatly destroyed. Kiev is greatly destroyed, and that will kind of ruin the reasoning that Putin gave for this exercise in the first place, or the reasoning that you read between the lines. But again, the shooting of the officers so that they stay in that area, to my mind, already indicates that Pravi sector and Azov are aware that there's not going to be any kind of significant action, definitely not in the near future, in central and western Ukraine. That most of the fighting will happen in the east, and the point is to not retreat and to fend them off. If, of course, Ukraine loses these forces, half their army will be destroyed, and then this is the moment that the Russians are going to wait for capitulation.
Yes, and I do want to bring this back around, but in terms of the propaganda, a lot of the Ukrainian nationalist propaganda, since, say, the fall of the Soviet Union, and especially recently, has been the Mongol hordes are at our doorstep. Now, again, for those of
Yeah,
you who are familiar with the history, the Mongols did sack Kiev, so they would they would have a field day with that if Russian forces even entered into the city, it, outside of a peace agreement. Let's just say that much. And so again, in terms of PR, not that Russia's too concerned about PR, even that would be again just a step too far. But the reason I bring up propaganda and the legitimization of propaganda is because there were two events this week. The media came out and said, well, Russia's war goals are only the Donbass, which once again makes it sound like, again, it justifies Russia's military operation much more to say the uninformed. And then, as of a few hours ago today, Biden had a moment of what I genuinely believe was senility, and he went off script saying that uh, Putin can't stay, and more or less giving away the game. And really, that's probably the one of the most pivotal statements made by a U.S. president in, again, since the fall of the Soviet Union in that regard, because that has always been the argument of the Russians. That's always been the argument of Putin, the Russian Foreign Ministry, Lavrov. All these people are saying, well, the warmongers in America want a regime change in Russia. And of course, they tried to walk it back. They had the PR teams out there trying to justify the statement, saying, oh, he actually meant this or he meant to say this. But you had that breaking news today that Biden, again, maybe by accident, maybe more deliberately, said that he wants Putin removed from office.
Yeah, they've backtracked on that statement, but I mean, it's back and forth all the time with them. It doesn't really even matter at this point. Russia is committed to this. Even the figures 40,000 dead or wounded, 15,000, 16,000, 14,000. Uh, all those arguments basically point to one thing, that even if the numbers were that large, and I don't believe they are, but even if they were, then you have to understand that they are being incredibly disciplined and that they are uh, not going to quit despite the losses. And I said, even from the time that the invasion happened, that Russia will absorb large losses, and it doesn't matter. Um, this is a pivotal moment because this is a demarcation zone. This is a boundary act, as John David Ebert would say. Um, it's just as important for Russia, basically, as it was for Otto the Great to do that with the Hungarians back in the 10th century, or in the 8th century with the Muslims in France. So it's a very important boundary act, and Russia is committed to this. And there was never going to be any other option. You can see how this situation deteriorated initially. Russia would have been happy to continue to pay rent and supply the cheapest gas in the world to Ukraine, as it was doing all throughout the 90s and the early 2000s. But that wasn't going to be the case. Mostly a lot of central and western Ukrainian nationalists wanted to pull Ukraine into the EU. And in fact, the document itself for the EU required that Ukraine, by joining the EU, had to commit to joining NATO. Now, this is interesting because recent facts, in an interview with Zelensky, he mentioned that in secret, the Biden administration would tell him there's no chance that you're going to be in NATO. But publicly, we will always say that the door is open to Ukraine. And so why on earth he's going with this, I don't know, because now it's obvious that there was never going to be a chance. But I would also argue that Ukraine is a de facto NATO territory, given the amount of influence, the amount of training, the amount of money, the amount of armaments that have been shipped there. One of the largest amounts in recent history. Let's say in the last 5 years, enormous amounts. Although, to be fair, tanks and jets have not been given to them, and that is substantial and important to note. So, in a way, this is a proxy war against Russia by the U.S., and I think Russia fully understands that. So Russia is fighting basically for its life. America is fighting for its lifestyle. That's a very important distinction. Because ultimately, as I said early on, there could have been an incorporation or cooperation with Russia. You notice that the more that America encroached on Russia and its buffer states, the more that Russia had to become more totalitarian, let's say, to maintain its influence, say, in Belarus, right? It does not have an option. And then you notice that in Europe, a similar effect is taking place, where in Czech Republic, for instance, if you're admittedly pro-Russian, you could go to jail for 3 to 5 years. There's other countries that have similar or slightly more lenient penalties for expressing those kinds of views.
Yes, and if those of you who are familiar with the ASB news channel, they were doing a lot of coverage on both Twitter and Telegram. They recently suspended operations. I believe they operated out of Latvia because of arrests of
Yes.
others who were covering the war, and they said that they didn't want to chance it. So they suspended operations insofar as that was concerned. Uh,
I'm so glad you said that.
it is happening. There is starting to be a black on information on the frontier territories, as it were, such as these Eastern European states. You
Hmm.
mentioned the Czech Republic. I believe Slovakia tried to do something similar, which is interesting between the two because the Czech Republic is one of those countries that really desires to be Western despite its Slavic roots, of course. Now, of course, you could argue that the Czechs are just Slavic language speaking Germans, which I don't know, maybe there's an argument for that. But the Slovaks, you look at polls time and time again. No, not like ethnicity, but like opinion polls. Don't get me wrong there.
Yeah.
But with that, Slovakia, out of all the NATO and EU countries, they're not necessarily pro Russia, but they probably have the most Russian sympathies outside of maybe, say, a country like Bulgaria. Uh,
Serbia
well,
or Bulgaria.
yeah, Serbia. I'm talking particularly EU and or NATO countries. Serbia is
Hmm. Hmm.
fortunately
Hmm.
neither at this point, but yes, outside of again probably Bulgaria, I think even Slovakia on some of those. So there is that desire there, which you could argue goes back to all the way back to before World War One, with the real idea of not necessarily a pan-Slavic state, but a Slavic civilizational bloc, and again, just the you can even look at some of the propaganda that came out of that. Of course, you had the Czech and Slovak legions, but that's getting into deep history that isn't too relevant right now. But again, I do think that is worth addressing at a later point, sometime in the future. But with that being
Hmm.
said, you do have all of that happening. And speaking of suppressions, the beacon of democracy, Volodymyr Zelensky, had some interesting political maneuvers this week. So
Yeah.
he consolidated all support parties into one governing coalition, as countries usually do during wartime. But conversely, he also banned all opposition parties, and that include
Yeah.
again, of course, include the For Life Party, which was run by Medvedchuk, who is a media mogul and noted pro-Russian politician out of Ukraine. Funny enough, a Western Ukrainian. So I guess the Galician Russophiles are still actually alive and well, which is a little bit of a surprise considering the past
Yeah.
100
I was
years.
surprised by that too.
Um, or again, that's assuming that the last name isn't just a fluke and just the way intermixing happens. But I do think he was actually from Western Ukraine, so that was interesting to note. With that
Well, I
also,
mean, I think he's being realistic. I think he understands realpolitik that the longer that a decision about what happens to Ukraine drags on, the more destruction and death there's going to be, right?
yes, and he has
Um,
been for the past several months, and that in fact the past several years, harassed by the law, and I think he's actually under house arrest right now. But his party, the For Life Party, was banned. Several other parties, the Communist Party was banned. Even some like more like centrist and middle of the line parties. But everything else that could have been consolidated into a ruling coalition has been consolidated into a ruling coalition. And all so-called
mhm.
opposition media within Ukraine has been banned. Now, again, when looking at this in a vacuum, when a country's at war, you can understand the consolidation of power. You can understand all of that. And again, I'm not even too worked up that about Ukraine's internal affairs right now, or they're not being democratic. You all know how I feel about democracy. But again, it goes down to the rhetoric, and we know these people are hypocrites. But it always helps to hammer in these points. It always helps to show the internal contradictions in the system. I know hypocrisy is one of the lowest forms of argument. Blah 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 doesn't really get anywhere. The imagine if the situation was reversed, I'm a frequent critic of. But I do think it is just a little amusing that the bastion of democracy, Volodymyr Zelensky, is the one who is busy consolidating his power right now. And it really shows that you can point out the hypocrisy angle, but I also think it shows something of a desperation that they know it's really on the ropes. And that, of course, is coupled with the preliminary backdoor negotiations that are still ongoing. Now, they said they had made progress on, quote, secondary items, but couldn't come to terms on the main focuses of the negotiation, which isn't surprising, but we'll see how that goes as
Mhm.
time goes on. But I do think the level of consolidation of power that's taken place within the Ukrainian government over the past week shows that A, they are digging in their heels and they are going to fight, and Zelensky is going to throw more lives into the meat grinder in order to keep up what is more or less a foregone conclusion. Just depends on how you get there rather than will you get there. And B, again, it shows that just they know that as well. They know that they're
Yeah.
digging in their heels because this is a latch ditch effort. And again, it's not even trying to get a more equitable footing at the negotiating table. It seems like, and I doubt the Ukrainian government officials believe this, but it seems like the message they're purporting is that this invasion can still be countered and driven back. And of course, if you talk to the more even out there elements, Ukrainian forces can be in Moscow by what, Christmas or whatever the whatever the arbitrary date that they throw out there is.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, Russia started this invasion, uh, and then if you're talking about invasion, you do have to outnumber the enemy at minimum 3-1, 2-1 minimum. Russia went in basically outnumbered, uh, about 2.5-1. Now there is a caveat to this, right? So Russia overall has a larger professional force to begin with. And the reason these figures are the way they are is because Ukraine, the amount of troops they have, there's also a lot more recent conscripts. To be fair, however, that it still is the case that the Russians did this invasion, a kind of a prodding into seeing where snipers are located, seeing where uh, air defense systems are located, seeing where jets and helicopters are flying off from. So it's been this kind of prodding reconnaissance mission with great costs have occurred. The latest figure I heard from Russia was 1,351. That does not account for the Donetsk, which initially was around 400. I'm going to presume that's more like 800 now. And the Donetsk People's Republics actually were fighting in Mariupol along with Chechens. And it would be those two forces that would have zero empathy for Azov because of the things that they endured the last 8 years at their hands. So there's no love lost there. Um, Now, I think the other thing that's interesting as more and more of these guys are arrested, you see tattoos and there are all these, let's say World War II mustache man tattoos, or not necessarily
Windmills
like
of peace, as
first
it were.
order. What's that?
The windmills of peace.
Yeah, I actually didn't see that many of them. More of like black suns and that kind of
Yes, so
thing.
the other windmill of
You
peace.
know, so it for me, one of the things that I know that I thought about this is, wars in of them themselves are they're like a territorial fight, of course, right? But the periphery of where this fight takes place is also where the culture can also go back in time, right? Um, so you could say things while you're killing Iraqis that you could never say at home, right? Um, And so these symbols, because they're fighting Russia, they can be tolerated, although they would never be tolerated at home, right? But I think also the important thing to note is as Russia is moving into these areas and taking them over, you're also looking at expunging these symbols, this sign language, this Western sign language from their territory. On a bigger metaphysical level, that is what's happening. So it is Western symbols that will also be removed uh, as this process goes on. Because I think when you think about it, why are Ukrainians attached to um, essentially Western symbols? None of these symbols are traditional symbols that belong to them. Some of the symbols you can argue, but you know, others you can't. They're actually German symbols. And so in a way, they're simping for the West, even if it's a West that died 75 years ago. It is still a West that can temporarily flicker with life in the war zone at the perimeter of the empire, if you understand what I mean by that, right? So that process is also interesting, that is happening. This expunging of foreign elements, foreign symbols. You notice that the West has left Russia. Um, all their soft power is leaving Russia. Um, Part of that is a messaging really for Western audiences, like, you know, our gay values are no longer going to be pushed in Russia. Those are our best values, and Russia is not going to get them. So, which is good for Russia, but I just find that kind of thinking, that kind of myopic thinking from a strategic point of view, kind of silly. But as I say, it was inevitable, right?
You know,
I think when
I
you
wanted to
look
actually
back,
touch on a specific example of the symbolism now that you brought it up in terms of them adopting Western symbols, even if they are from World War II era regimes, as we can put it in YouTube friendly terms, is that one thing I noticed that, again, I took particular offense to, but beyond just my personal feelings, I think is really telling, is Ukraine, which keep in mind is more or less just as Christian as a country as Russia, whatever metric you want to use. Again, of the same Orthodox tradition. Now, again, you can get into the question of the current schism going on right now in the internal church politics. Put all that aside. That's irrelevant to the point I'm going to make. There has been, I'm not saying it's common, but I've seen it more likely than I would have thought, renditions of the Saint George slaying the dragon icon, except the dragon
mm-hmm.
is the Russian double-headed eagle, which of course they got from Byzantium, which of course for 1,000 years was considered the center of Eastern Christianity. So you have this again really warped thing of that again, like trying to appropriate the
Right.
symbol, not only and using that to slay a quintessentially not only Russian, but you could say you could almost say Eastern European symbol, and that they really are trying to again assimilate into the West with that. And I thought that was interesting. And of course, there's the um, I I hate to even say this, but the now this is more, of course, Western redditors who more so post this, but I do think it's worth mentioning in terms of how they're trying to draw Ukraine in the West. Those pictures of the Virgin Mary with the javelin, the so-called Saint javelins that I become violently angry every time I see. Don't get me wrong, but again, I do think it shows that not only it started out with the Ukrainian identity. I'm not saying these two things are mutually exclusive. Where from 2014 onwards, the argument is we're the real Rus. The Russians are all intermixed with Mongols and Turks, and they're just pretending to be the Turks. So pretty much their claim was like, we're the real East Slavs. But it's
Yeah,
evolved
yeah,
since then, since further so-called integration with the West, that they're even rejecting that like primal East Slavic identity and trying to LARP as again Western Germanics.
yeah. Who also kind of looked down on them. I mean, they incorporated them, they used them, and there were often the guards at at these work camps. Um, but I would say that yeah, so there is a kind of LARPing, and you can see why in the dissident right, and even in the normie right within the West, there's always a preference for these groups. One is they're pawns. They don't pose any threat. The second one is that they absorb Western symbology, even stuff that's verboten, uh, and that it's kind of like I remember being at a party years and years ago, and there was a liberal Serbian poet that was there. I won't mention his name, and there was at least 20, 25 people from all different kinds of backgrounds, and he had decided that he was going to go back to Bosnia. That's where he was from. And there was a Canadian family there. They were just horrified, like, how can you do that? And this was about, I would say, 5 years after the end of the war, maybe six, but no more than that. And it like they took this as rejection. I'll give you another example. I have a normie friend. He's conservative. He's right of center, but he identifies himself as a non-denominational Christian, and he identifies as a libertarian. Right now, he loves Poland. Well, you'll never like. He'll just ignore how much Poland depends on, let's say, the EU and what it can get away with and can't get away with. But the bottom line is, it's a thankful nation. It to the West. It's non-threatening. They're allowed to be based because they're an enemy of Russia to some degree. Although there's an erosion of that, we know with Poland and Hungary, for instance, uh, that there are going to be massive sanctions on them when this war is over, but they have been delayed because Poland is dealing with a massive refugee influx. So you can see that whatever is non-threatening, whatever has partly assimilated into the West, is thankful to the West, is preferred, right? And for the dissident right, if they're still able to keep some kind of baseness going on, they're not going to question where that comes from. Like, they'll have all kinds of theories about, well, that's because they can intimidate, and it's like, no, it's because they're necessary as fighters against Russia. Like, that's their purpose.
Yes, and
Even
I
the
do
West.
think I wanted to touch on your point of Western admiration for LARPers, and I do think I know you brought up the right wing in particular, but it's something that's all across the spectrum. For example, if you remember the fetishism of the Kurdish fighters, whether that was the liberals saying,
Mm,
look at these brave women, or the communists who went over and volunteered to go fight with a group that called themselves like, what do they call themselves, like democratic, like federalists who espouse some form of Marxism. But point being is you have that, and then, of course, you have the admiration for these groups. And then you could say, even more in the mainstream right, I would say Israel is the big elephant in the room, the Zionist movement. They love to live through these nationalists. Poland is another one. So it's this attitude in the West because anything outside of the mainstream, and even, again, parts of the mainstream, has become so watered down that virtually everyone, you and I included, I would say most of our audience included, feels the need to root for somebody who represents a pure idea of their beliefs abroad.
right, right. Even though none of us are ever going to move to these regions, that they have effects on us, but not in the first order
Are
that
you
they
doubting
do.
my plans to repatriate to Sicily? I'll have you know they're well underway.
Yeah, so that's um, that's a common thing, and you see this in the dissident right. All you have to do is look at the chat, academic agents chat, and it's nonstop, 24/7 arguments.
Oh, that place
Who
is wild.
has?
I love it. I would recommend each and every one of you join it.
I can only take so much of it. It just becomes so repetitive. Um, but the vast majority are anti-NATO, which, speaking realistically, anti-NATO means anti-Ukraine. The fact is Ukraine would have been a pushover without NATO, and yeah, so it's funny that he gave this option, for if you chose. I think there were several options: neutral, totally neutral, pro-Ukraine, pro-NATO, pro-Russia. There were several options, but there were some people even saying, well, why not be pro-Ukraine and anti-NATO? It's like, what? I mean, Ukraine had hardly any forces in 2014, right? Like, all their training is to integrate perfectly with other NATO units. So you know, with like I say, they are a de facto proxy NATO state. And this was always going to happen when you look back in retrospect over the last 30 years, that that Russia cannot be integrated into Europe. That's impossible. And I think that's really good for Russia, personally. Um, you have ridiculous statements like van der Leyen, she said the age of being blackmailed by the Russians will come to an end. It's like, what's the blackmailing? I mean, you filled their countries with NGOs, with gay propaganda. You introduced sanctions because they didn't want your stupid gay culture. They never stopped selling you the gas and so on. They didn't hike up the price or short you on the amount. Like, what blackmail? Like, you were trying to blackmail them. And to that, there are this week, Russia has said that unless Europe is willing to pay for their gas, I'm going to presume oil is included, but I
Yes, they
can't
said oil and
guarantee.
gas, and I was just about to bring this up, so continue.
Yeah, so unless they pay in the ruble, they're not getting any. And that's interesting because Saudi Arabia and Qatar have already stated that they're at maximum production. And if Russia leaves the European market entirely, they cannot replace it. And
Yes,
you
and that's on
have,
top of the Gulf states' negotiation with China in terms of accepting oil in multiple currencies as opposed to the petrodollar, which I will continue to make the point the petrodollar as a hegemonic force is effectively dead.
yeah, it's just a matter of time now. That's the way it's going to go. That's the way it's going to be. When you also look at how many countries are remaining resolute not to condemn Russia and to continue to trade with them, uh, India is a big surprise. Now, I know there's been videos out there about, India's stuck in this place, between the West and China and Russia on the other hand. Well, um, India already told America they had a 12-member delegation that was supposed to arrive, I believe, Thursday, uh, to India to discuss the situation. And India just flat out told them, we're not going to be lectured by you. We don't want you to be here. You are not invited. And then the next day, Wang Yi from China showed up. And that tells you just about everything. And when you put these pieces together, you know that like this was Russia invading could not have been done earlier, as I've said before, because their foreign reserves were almost entirely made up of US dollars. That quickly changed in the course of 8 years. That was cut to well less than half. And, um, I don't think Russia would even have made this move without getting assurances from India, China, and it looks like also, well, I mean, Saudi Arabia and Qatar are still on board, and I mean, even Assad visited Qatar last week. So,
Yes, and that's also on top of them refusing the phone call from Biden, accepting Syria, rejecting the U.S. So again, it is we're watching in real time. Once again, I will reiterate the global order fall apart, and I'm glad you brought up the energy markets because again, you mentioned that Saudi Arabia and Qatar both said they're at max production. You're not going to get much more of the Gulf states. Russia's threatening to leave the European market. You had some of the protest groups, for example, there was a collective of Greek farmers who have been protesting the energy cost right now and saying that they're just about doomed without it. You have that on top of there being an expected diesel shortage in the United States, and also Biden referencing the possibility of a food shortage earlier this week. So
mhm.
the economic consequences continue to fall like a string of dominoes, and there's really no end in sight. Now, maybe some of our older viewers out there can give me a little bit of perspective. And I was talking to my parents who would have been again at least cognizant of the current events at the time, not to reveal too much about their age, about the economic crises and the energy shortages in the 1970s. And the question is, I don't know. Did there seem like a way out then? Because maybe it's because this is the crisis we're experiencing currently, but I don't see a way out even if we were to revive domestic production in which some states are defying federal government orders. I believe Montana was one of them, and revamping domestic oil production. I think that would alleviate the burden, but too much damage from my assessment has already been done for just the domestic energy production to remedy all of this, especially on a worldwide scale. Again, it may alleviate things significantly in the United States, but you still have a global crisis on your hands.
Right. And there's also now the fate of Europe, where gas prices are far, far higher than they are in Canada and the US. This will almost certainly begin to gut the industrial potential of Europe. A Michelin plant has closed down. There was, I believe, a Renault automaker in Czech Republic that has temporarily closed down, and I predict, of course, things will get far worse, long before they get better. Because a lot of these pipelines, if you exclude Nord Stream 1 and 2, really these pipelines, these other land based pipelines, they were all built during the Soviet era, right? And America then protested their construction. But that's what Europe needed, and Europe prospered for it. Because, for one, Russia has a very heavy crude type oil that's good for industry, for industrial production. And of course, they have very good gas, a very good quality of gas that needs less refinement, much preferable say, compare it to shale derived gas. So Europe is going to suffer as well as a result of this. And we may see a kind of gutting out of the economy in Europe as more American brands go in. This is also probably a reason why, because America doesn't have a manufacturing base really, why it can't go too hard on China, because what is it going to fill this vacuum up with? They cannot. I mean, we've seen nothing yet. I'm not in any way prognosticating what is going to happen, but I'm just saying, after a month, there hasn't really been, except for some cosmetic sanctions against China, there hasn't really been anything substantive that Trump didn't already introduce and that Biden didn't follow in his first year in office. So that remains an open question. We will see. You can see that the efforts of the Americans is to try to destroy any lifeline that is afforded to it by countries like India and China. But Saudi Arabia, they're going to start selling oil with the yuan. I'm very sure a very similar agreement, if one doesn't already exist, is going to be there with China with regards to Russia. India now no longer uses the American dollar to buy and sell oil either. 30 million barrels were just recently delivered. So I think the next phase that we're going to look at is the Americans will resort to a kind of international piracy, where their naval fleet will try to cut off shipments overseas. And you can see why the Belt and Road Initiative that began in Altai, Kazakhstan in August 2013, notice how 3-4 months later Maidan begins, why internal infrastructure over the great Eurasian continent is so important, right? Because that is the way that you bypass American power.
Yes, and you could even argue
So,
that you would see a Persian Gulf crisis that we saw in 2019 on a much larger and even global scale, with the seizure of oil tankers, with the seizure of these ships. Of course, we were able to do that to Iran, and as the situation becomes more undesperate with the, let's just say, talking heads in Washington, especially with Biden, become more and more unhinged, you could see some sort of policy like this with the suspension of some trade. Of course, the U.S. Navy does still indisputably control global sea routes, which once again increases the potential for conflict far greater than it has been, I would say, in the past 70 years, probably since the Cuban Missile
mhm.
Crisis at least. Past 60 years, that would make it. With, again, the controller of the global sea lanes deciding to implement these draconian policies. And you've already seen things going in this direction, and you will probably continue to see it with other countries, even so-called allied countries of the United States, revamping their naval capabilities in order to provide for themselves. For example, we it was under the Trump administration, but I do think it shows a sign of things to come, where Trump suggested to European nations, if they're concerned about the security of their oil coming from the Gulf, perhaps they should send their own ships to help escort and guard those seas. Which,
Hmm.
again, that was a wild Trumpian policy. But now I do think the world will understand what they feared under Trump, which is an American empire that is actually willing to leverage its control over the seas.
Right, right, exactly. And I believe it will exert even more soft power on Europe. Like Europe, first of all, has already been greatly transformed into a kind of, you know, American zone of power, right? And if you look back at, tapes of Zbigniew Brzezinski on CSIS or the Atlantic Council, like when they sort of figure out where the situation is going, and of course they want Russia to be subjugated. They want Russia to return to the 90s, or they want Russia to be divided into 5 to 7 different countries and so on. When it looks like that isn't going to be the case, they'll say, well, they'll just become a Chinese puppet state. And of course, they don't mention that there's a, a Russian population in China, and they're not infringed upon. And just like when China had a one-child policy, that did not extend towards Tibetans, Uyghurs, or Russians. That was mainly for Han, or peoples, polities that identify closely with the Han, because a lot of China, like that isn't Han, are closely related. It's much more like talking about Europe than talking about like the kind of disparity of differences that exist, say, in the US of various ethnic and racial groups. Um, the groups within are far less different from one another, broadly speaking. So, um, and like I say, there never was going to be an option because, of course, we know now that of the Ukraine was going to destroy the Donbass. They had amassed hundreds of thousands of troops. Uh, there are estimates between 70 to 120,000 to take on the Donbass. The Donbass at best has 35,000. So they had been building up for 8 years. And then once that was done, then they could focus entirely on Crimea. And so that was never going to happen. That could not be allowed to happen. And of course, if Russia was going to be drawn into this war, then we would have a Cold War that would be even more severe than the previous one. But it is what Russia has to do, and as you know, I've been to Russia 4 times, and I can tell you that Canada has a Chinese population that's at least 4 times bigger than theirs. And no, I haven't only gone to St. Petersburg and Moscow. So yeah,
And
but
to bring up that point regarding the Russian-Chinese relationship, which we do often touch on, is that it seems like the rhetoric out of the West is you can't cooperate with China because if you do, they'll do to you what we're currently doing to you.
yeah.
Like they tried to project this far down the road threat rather than the immediate threat. Which, okay, let's take them at their word. Let's assume that China does have these plans for Russia. At the time, again, the West's efforts of isolation and activity against Russia is the much more pressing issue. So even if China is, of course, plotting this great takeover of Russia, which I'm not saying they are, that seems like a much less pressing issue at this time. And
Yeah.
again, I do think that also that take also ignores, and people on both sides of this also ignore, that Russia still has a significant amount of influence over China. Now, China's ace in the hole when it comes to leveraging Russia is probably its integration into its financial sectors because, of course, after the 2014 sanctions, after a lot of Western banks put restrictions on it, and now we're seeing outright pullouts, the Chinese did swoop in the financial market, so they do have that. But once again, you also have Russia with the energy market, and you could argue they're also
Hmm.
more militarily advanced in that they do contract out a lot of, say, those military designs to China. So while I'm not, it is almost hard to say there's a junior and a senior partner because it depends on what you're talking about. Of course, China is economically superior in terms of its ability to project economic influence, but it
Yeah.
is a partnership, I would say, almost on equal footing. Now, time will tell, but once again, I reiterate, so long as the current global order with the American empire, especially the now decrepit American empire, is in place, the question of a Russian Chinese fallout is simply not going to happen. We're not going to have that Henry Kissinger moment, that Richard Nixon moment, where we go either to Moscow or Beijing and manage to convince them to turn on each other. It simply isn't going to happen. The geopolitical situation between the 1970s and today, while there may be many similarities, while there may be many parallels, in that regard, they are worlds apart. And
Yeah.
any
China
hope,
is not the China of the 70s.
absolutely not. Again, there's no sweetheart deal we could make to either Russia or China that would convince them to turn coat on the other. And I don't know, maybe 15, 20 years ago, we could have halted NATO expansion, maybe even promised Russia influence, if not integration, of parts of the former Soviet Union and former Russian Empire. Maybe that would have been the sweetheart deal we could have made them. But again, it's about 15 years at least too late for something like that to happen because the Western elites, they got greedy, they got short-sighted, they did what they did in the 90s and early 2000s, and squandered any real long-term strategy, which I suppose in some ways is a shame because you could have had this great reconciliation, but that was cut short. And once again, that was at the fault of Western hubris. I'm not saying that, of course, Russia's perfect. Once again, just to preempt anyone who would accuse me of just being this unprincipled chill. Not that I don't think, not that I think any of you would, but point being is a lot of what Russia's done, even if you do disagree on principle, has been very pragmatic. Where a lot of the West has done just seems like greedy short-sightedness.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's in China's interest to to keep Russia healthy, growing, and safe. Because if if they lose Russia, they lose. That's how important this is. If Russia loses, America has the ability to turn the tap off and on, and this is why, strategically, why they wanted to appeal to Russia's liberal class or wealthy Jewish oligarchs, why they wanted to appeal to even Russian nationalists that particularly dislike Central Asians and Chinese. It is because it works in their favor, right? What America is offering is, listen, you let us take over, and you can squeeze the Chinese for a lot more. You can get a lot richer, right? You just give up a little bit of your sovereignty, and that's what you'll have. Now, that's an important. This completely correlates with what you were saying about the kind of deal that America made with China that helped China make what China is today, and that comes out of a kind of age of enlightenment and very capitalist idea of the world, which desacralizes property. It desacralizes territory. It was always understood in the feudal era that the king and the people, even the serfs, have an obligation to the land. You get protection, I'll give you the land to grow your food to
And
survive.
even into the Enlightenment and Democratic era, so called, there was an implicit understanding pretty much up until the 20th century that land ownership equated political power and that many countries had weighted voting where your, again, landing did influence how much of a say you had in society because, again, it was
Yeah.
understood as something as just more than a commodity. It was understood as something that you actually not only own, but you have a responsibility to maintain, and that comes with certain rights and privileges.
Right. And the only kind of sacramental order that still exists, of course, for territory is for, keeping it green, for conservation. Not that those things aren't important, but really that is the only place ideologically uh, that there is any footing for it.
Yes, and as you said,
The previous
it's more of
Christian
like a
era,
cynical
no,
play of it.
that's gone. And you could also look at the deal that America made to get rid of its industry in order to make more profit is desacralizing America itself,
Yes, of course, you
right?
can go back to one of the frequent right wing criticisms of the 20th and 21st century America, that is the global shopping mall. And I believe it's term the neoliberal is used in a positive light in the 90s. And fundamentally, it is when you outsource the production of what you need to survive as a nation. Not that every nation can be autarkic, nor should it, but when you outsource your core industries that you are more than capable of maintaining, again, that is just short sighted greed and the recipe for your own destruction. Now, of course, you could very realistically make the argument, and I would, the American elites are just vultures plundering what is there before they move on to their next target. Yeah, so, again, you could get
Yeah.
into that and you could speculate about will Russia and China be next? How will they deal with this parasitic class that we all know what I'm talking about? And again, those are all very interesting questions for a future date. But again, I think as so long as the American empire stands, that is really the focus, especially as it becomes more unhinged, especially as we watch the fall in real time. And with that being said, in terms of the energy market, I did just have one last big story I want to cover, and this is actually touching on the Middle East, touching with the war between Saudi Arabia and the Houthi movement of Yemen. So, what you had there is the Saudis, of course, under Mohammed bin Salman, have made this effort to be more open to the world. As I'm sure you all know, we've covered that in great detail.
Mm-hmm.
And that includes bringing in, again, whether it be concerts, sporting events, the works. And recently, it was in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, where they were able to, host the Formula One racing. And during that, you had a Houthi missile strike on an oil field about 7 miles from the event. And
Yes.
this is the same, again, this is the same organization that expelled Russia over the Ukraine crisis. And again, all these organizations, all these sporting events, all these, again, entertainment things have also pulled out of Russia as part of this great, uh, divestment from Russia. But of course, it's not about principle. We all know the reason why they do it, but it just does show an interesting light that, of course, missiles raining down 7 miles away from you more of is less of a pressing concern than a border dispute in Ukraine. So that is really with that. And again, I believe the Houthis probably feel pretty emboldened given that, and this is on top of Saudi Arabia claiming that it's at maximum production already, that it's drilling as much as it can with these strikes on these oil fields. So that can only be assumed to further push the energy market. And perhaps this is at the direction of the Iranians, perhaps that because of course they are intertwined. Perhaps this is just the Houthis continuing on with their regular operations because this is something they would have likely done absent of all of this. This has been going on since 2015. This war is, insofar as that's concerned, so far as the Houthi actions, has happened in somewhat of a vacuum compared to the rest of global politics. Now, of course, Saudi Arabia has had other considerations towards options, but you don't hear about, and maybe it's, again, just a media blackout, you don't hear about many Saudi strikes in Yemen. It does seem like they've curtailed those. I remember the UAE was making moves to actually pull out of that war. But at the end of the day, it looks like the Houthis do have the advantage. Perhaps we'll see some great retaliation towards them in the next few days, next few weeks. But that's just on top of everything else. And like I said, I'm not saying outright that maybe this was suggested or coordinated by Iran, but if they had a strategic mind about them, it makes perfect sense why they would do this at this exact moment. And really, again, there's that further encroachment because the American backed Gulf states for the past 7 years haven't been able to dislodge this group where, again, Yemen is one of the most impoverished countries in the world as a result of this war. These groups are severely undersupplied and everything, probably just about, aside from everything, probably except missiles. So
Mm-hmm.
at the end of the day, it just goes on to show more and more of a decrepit empire. Now, that was actually brought to the attention by a friend of the show who I do believe wishes to remain anonymous, so I'll respect that. But it does, because I just heard about this last night. So it's been overshadowed by everything, understandably, with all the happenings in both Ukraine and the global economy, and which is a direct result of the events with Russia and Ukraine. But with that being said, you're starting to see the ripple effects of this worldwide. And just as a side note, tensions are picking up again in the Caucasus and Nagorno
Yes.
Karabakh. You had the declaration of martial law. You had reports from the Russian Defense Ministry that Shoigu had a phone call with defense officials in Azerbaijan to try to mediate the situation and talk through it. So you see that conflict zone, which was in late 2020, had a very patchwork peace agreement. You see that starting to flare up again, which, again, probably the only combat zone of the past years that hasn't really flared up again is, funny enough, Syria. Now, we haven't touched much on Syria. We'll definitely have to in the upcoming episode just to give a general overview on how things have been going there. But it does seem like, and I do speculate as the attention is focused on other parts of the world, that now would be the time when real negotiations for a longer term peace do begin in Syria. That would just be my prediction. And I still maintain that by the end of summer, Idlib will be no more as a rebel controlled area.
Well, I'm hoping, but now that you bring up Syria, and we all remember all the fake gas attacks which are remarkably ineffective, even according to Pentagon papers. When you look back at the war between Iran and Iraq, they have a kill ratio of like 2 to 3%. But nonetheless, they pushed this idea that Assad was gassing his own people, like particularly when he won, like over Aleppo, which the siege of Aleppo happened very similarly to the siege in Mariupol. Try to get as many civilians out as possible, extend the siege, cut off supply lines, let them waste all their bullets, let them begin running out of food and water, and so on and so on. And now there's more and more talk about a possible psyop, gayop, whatever you want to call it, happening in Kiev. And I suppose the possibility of that increases the more that the Ukrainian military begins to lose, because there isn't one significant piece of territory or town that the Ukrainians have been able to take back since the start of the war. So I would say that's one of the flashpoints. The other flashpoint is if Poland is inundated, let's say with another million or two refugees, then the possibility of Poland seeing no option but to get involved, irrespective of a psyop even, we might see that. That
Yes,
might
and
happen.
also in that same vein, you had Hungary considering the deployment of peacekeepers to the Transcarpathian region, which does have a significant amount of ethnic Hungarians. Which,
Mm-hmm.
so you did see that, and just again, not to give Orban too much credit, it could be just a general defense of co-ethnics, which I'm sure probably wouldn't be that great of an effect in the conflict. But I mean, Hungary's also received a flood of Ukrainian refugees as well, and you have the U.S. discussing the resettlement of anywhere from something like 100,000 to 3 million, so casting a very large net of Ukrainian refugees in the United States. Now, out of all the people we could take in, like, if I had to pick between all the wars we've been involved in, I have to admit Ukrainians are probably the least bad of that bunch, but that's still bringing in hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of people into a country that is already in dire straits. And once again, you could see you do bring up a good point that a lot of these countries may feel forced to act if these waves continue. Just for the same reason, Turkey actually intervened in Syria, trying to set up a so-called safe zone.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
you
I'm so
might
glad you mentioned that.
you might see something of that. And again, knowing Erdogan, who knows, he could be one of the ones who comes out and advocates this or advises it, just knowing him. And then, of course, next week he'll make some conciliatory statements towards the Russians. But the model has been shown, particularly, again, in Turkey's operations in northern Syria, on how to create a safe zone without getting too involved in the conflict. So you could see, as you brought up, a Polish or I don't know, arguably even Hungarian. I doubt that much, but I think Poland would be the main one to look out for. Establishment of a safety corridor. Now, speaking of safety corridors, apparently, just touching on Mariupol again, the civilians there, according to a few different reports, now a lot of these reports are more pro-Russian, so you can take them with a grain of salt, just whatever, that a lot of these civilians either didn't know or feared reprisal by taking the humanitarian corridor out of the city. But again, that has been laid to rest. And with the fall of a city like that, with the encirclement of Kiev, with the encirclement of these major cities, again, I really can't say what I think is going to be the outcome of the conflict, because I remember at the beginning of this, many speculated that it will only be a few days, it will only be a week. We're just over a month. It was on February 24th, so just a month plus a few days since the outbreak of the conflict. And I mean, it's a foregone conclusion that's a Russian victory, but what will the consequences of that victory look like? What will the post-war order of Ukraine look like? A lot of these questions are still up in the air, and especially considering the fact that, again, what will NATO do? What will the NATO response be? Of course, you also had what I saw was the U.S. Army in particular. I don't know if it was the entire military, but I think it was the Army in particular, which, of course, in any event of an outbreak in Europe, they would be the ones who carried most of the American weight, was lowering their recruitment and active combat troop standards. And you had the Selective Service Administration put out a statement on Twitter that, for conscientious objectors, they could do alternative jobs such as working in FEMA camps. Now, I don't want to get too conspiratorial on the show, but bro, they're going to put us in camps, aren't they? Now, I won't definitively say that, but I will say watch your six. But point being is, you have, from what I can see, aside maybe from the possibility of a Polish Turkish style intervention in Ukraine, I would say that actually is a very real possibility. So far, the United States and Western Europe seem to be taking an all bark, no bite approach. Now, that could rapidly change, but as we discussed before during Zelensky's speech to Congress, while I don't doubt many in America would love to get involved, many in the American leadership would want to get involved, I don't think they see a way they can do it. Now, of course, they're trying to draw that red line. If Russia uses chemical weapons, we will intervene. Now, we saw how well that worked out in Syria after the first two times that worked out. Again, there were a total of two strikes. So, one could say this is a lot of talk. I don't expect the U.S. to engage in any sort of military action. Now, I could have to eat those words at the end of the world, but I'm sticking to that for the time being, because again, I don't think, even in the event of some horrible Russian atrocity, such as the use of chemical weapons, that the American public as a whole, could be convinced to go full bore into Ukraine. You already have the questions of the no-fly zone. Of course, you have people who come out and endorse the no-fly zone, but once they actually figured out what it is, at least among average people, like, no, that would cause World War III. Look, we might not like what Russia's doing, blah blah blah, but we're not going to risk a nuclear conflict over it.
Right. Like so much of this war, we'll have to wait and see. Even figures every day, we have to parse them out, and we often wait for days to see how accurate they are. There's a lot of speculation that this is the thickest fog of any war that I think you and I have ever covered. Far more than Syria, for instance, right? And that's probably because there is so much at stake. This is so world changing, even more so than Syria. And you mentioned Nagorno-Karabakh, and it's like, obviously that is to draw the Russians away, right? This is an easy strike to do while Russia is fully immersed in what is happening in Ukraine. And it's why also that there was an attempt at a color revolution in Kazakhstan, which kind of failed basically after 72 hours. Yes, so we will have to wait and see. I'm guessing that this coming week, we're going to see probably even bigger battles near the end of the week, as more and more Ukrainian forces are going to be encircled. And I would also predict that there is going to be an increase of Russian troops to um, basically stay in the areas that they've already conquered and supply new troops and new lines of equipment and fuel and food into the new battle zones that are emerging.
Yes, and that's all I had in particular for this week. If you have any additional stories that you think we missed, now would be the time. But again, there's only so much we can say with the progress of the war because, as you were saying, the fog of war is the thickest that we've probably seen in our lifetimes out of anything, whether that be, again, even just referencing back to you who lived through the wars in Yugoslavia, etc. Or well, not directly, but you could.
Not directly, no.
Even though I think many would be fooled, I think they would think that I'm harboring a Serbian war criminal, which I may be, just not you. Let's just clarify, okay?
Yeah.
But with that being said, that is all I had in regard for this week, and I do promise you, next episode we will have a more comprehensive Syria update because, in light of recent events, we have neglected one of the mainstays of the show, one of the main topics that we are known for covering, at least in our small little community here. So, of course, if you have anything, now would be the time. If not, I'm going
Yeah.
to
The
wrap
only the
this.
only thing I'll say is, if the outcome of this war will directly affect the reach and power that Global Homo has. If Global Homo loses this conflict, its reach will be severely diminished and it will force change in the West and it will open up new opportunities. If it wins, it will be far worse than what we already have.
Yes, and I did see that point as well, and I'm glad you brought that up. That, again, arguably, even for so called Western dissidents, the morale boost of a tentative, even just a tentative victory in Ukraine for the regime would be worse for us because even the people who weren't explicitly pro Russia, that is going to be a label of social ostracization. Now, again, I doubt they would take legal actions against most, but again, for example, think about somebody like a Tucker Carlson who's
Oh yeah.
made some very heterodox statements on this conflict and on many other items. You could see, I don't know, possibly the license to have him finally taken off the air as they've been trying to do for ages now. But point being is, in the event of a loss, you could see how that might lead to them wanting to crack down in the short term. But fundamentally, it will have to lead either to a reevaluation or continuing spiraling down the same path, in which case they'd become less and less effective of a regime. So, at which point,
Mm-hmm.
again, probably even, again, divorced of your personal opinions, speaking as just somebody who lives in the United States, lives in a Western country, the worst thing I think could happen would be a Ukrainian victory in terms of solidifying the regime, because they would again come out with a vengeance. They would feel very vindicated in all of this, and not that I think much legal would happen, especially in the states, just because of the way the system is made with the soft totalitarianism. You could see a lot of, let's just say, so-called cancellations of just a lot of people who, again, hold those views that aren't necessarily in lockstep with the regime.
Right. Then there's no hope if that happens. They won't even need right wingers anymore. Far from this idea that if Ukraine emerges victorious, nationalists in Ukraine will be even stronger than before. They won't. They will become obsolete, particularly if Russia is on a very bad footing afterwards, and it doesn't seem like they'll be able to fight back at all.
Yes, and
You know,
at which
unless
case
there's speculation of an invasion, a full-on invasion of Russia, there won't be any need for them.
at which case I do think the use of WMDs, whether that be nuclear or chemical or biological, in the event of a so-called Ukrainian victory or a Western victory, I suppose would be more appropriately called, the likelihood of again WMDs being used increases significantly if they think Russia is on a backpedal.
Yeah.
And again, this is speculating far down the road. At that point, that's when you break those out. Those are the last ditch weapons they use. That would be Russia's last line of defense is holding the world
Hmm.
in a pretty much position of nuclear hostage. And just to touch on that, you also had North Korea conducting missile tests as well. So things continue to chug along the path in which they're going. And again, not that I think a Ukrainian victory will happen, but I would just say it would embolden all the wrong people for us. And that is all I had for this episode. So thank you,
Yeah.
everyone, for tuning in to yet another episode of the War Report. I know we were a couple days delayed, but there's a lot of ground to tread, so sometimes it's better to wait a little bit. It's not like we're doing 3 episodes a week like we were some certain weeks, but we will see you guys next time, and goodbye.
Goodbye and take care.